Today, we're digging into the incredible and deeply complex story of South Korea's rise, how it went from the ashes of war to an absolute global powerhouse. And it all really comes down to this one question, right? How does a country go from being one of the poorest on earth to a top-tier economy in a single human lifetime? How is that even possible? So let's unpack that. To really get what people call the miracle on the Han River, you have to understand where they started from. And honestly, it's just hard to wrap your head around. So you look at this, right? The difference is just night and day. On one side, a country completely flattened by war, with no real natural resources, poorer than many nations in sub-Saharan Africa. And on the other, the hyper-modern, tech-savvy, cultural leader we see today. Now, this didn't just happen. This was designed. All right, so let's get into the how. Because the engine that powered all this growth, it was a really powerful and, yeah, a pretty controversial idea about what a government should be doing. And it all revolves around this one key idea, the developmental state. And you got to understand, this concept completely flips the usual script on its head when it comes to the role of government in the economy. So, in this model, the government isn't just some passive referee on the sidelines. No, it's the main architect, the one drawing up the blueprints for the entire economy. It was super top-down, totally interventionist, and had this laser focused on one thing: grow fast and export everything you can. The government was literally picking which industries would win and then pushing all of its resources, all of its chips in their direction. Now, the state wasn't doing this alone. It forged this really complex partnership. Sometimes it worked great, other times it was super tense, with these giant family-run companies we all know today, the Chaebol. The deal was basically this: we, the government, will give you cheap loans, tax breaks, and protect you from foreign competition. In return, you have to hit your export targets, no excuses. They were, for all intents and purposes, tools of national policy. And this whole thing wasn't just a free-for-all. It was a very deliberate step-by-step strategy. You can think of it like climbing a ladder. At the bottom, they started with the simple stuff, things that required a lot of labor, like textiles. And believe it or not, wigs. Wigs were a huge early export that brought in that crucial first bit of cash. From there, they climbed to the next rung: heavy industry, steel, ships, chemicals. And finally, they made that massive leap to the top, to the high-tech stuff that we all know them for today: semiconductors, electronics, and cars. But, and this is a huge but, you just don't get that kind of incredible breakneck growth for free. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It came with massive and often really painful trade-offs. And this right here, this is the core conflict of the whole story. For every single mind-blowing economic gain you see on the left, there was a deep social and political price paid on the right. During those critical decades of growth, democracy, for all practical purposes, was put on ice. And you have to ask, who paid that price? Well, the costs weren't shared equally at all. Political opposition crushed under authoritarian rule. Workers, they faced incredibly long hours and brutal conditions to keep those export prices low. And what about a social safety net? Things like healthcare or pensions? Nope. That was considered a luxury. Every single penny was being plowed back into building up the industry. It was a system that created enormous wealth, for sure, but that wealth got concentrated right at the top with the Chaebols. So all of this pressure, this relentless pace, it created this intense, almost chaotic social environment. And it was so unique that sociologists actually came up with a special term to describe exactly what was happening. And that term is compressed modernity. This is a really key idea if you want to understand the human side, the social fallout of this economic miracle. So what does it even mean? Well, think about it like this. All the big changes that took, centuries to play out in places like Europe or the US, the Industrial Revolution, people flooding into cities, the fight for democracy, in Korea, all of that happened at the same time. It was all crammed into just a couple of decades. So you had these ancient traditional values smashing right up against the demands of a hyper-modern factory floor. And that collision, it created an incredible amount of social stress. I love this analogy. It's like trying to run brand new, cutting-edge software on really old, outdated hardware. The system just isn't built for that speed. You have this incredibly powerful economic engine, but the society running it is still reeling from this dizzying, disorienting transition. It creates all this friction, all these glitches.
Tragically, this relentless pali, which means hurry, hurry in Korean, this culture that was so vital for economic success, well, it had absolutely devastating physical consequences.
This number, 502, that's not just a statistic. That is the number of people who lost their lives when the Sampoong department store in Seoul literally pancaked in 1995. And the horrifying thing is, this wasn't some freak accident. It wasn't an isolated event. Just the year before, a major bridge in Seoul collapsed during morning rush hour. These disasters weren't random. They were symptoms. Symptoms of a system where the obsession with building fast, far outpaced any real culture of safety or regulation. It was a brutal, tragic lesson in the real human cost of cutting corners. So, where does that leave us? How do we make sense of all this? You've got this incredible story of economic triumph on one hand, and this story of profound social cost on the other. How do you hold both of those truths at the same time?
Well, the key is to see them as two sides of the very same coin. You really can't understand modern South Korea without looking at both. The developmental state, that's the how. It's the brilliant, powerful engine that made the whole economic liftoff possible. But compressed modernity, that shows you the consequences. The social turbulence, the inequality, and the very real dangers that came from moving at that incredible speed.
So, when you look back, the Korean miracle isn't some simple how-to guide that any country can just copy and paste. It's a really powerful and, yeah, sometimes a cautionary story. It teaches us that development is always full of complex trade-offs. It reminds us that real, lasting progress has to be about more than just numbers on a GDP chart. Ultimately, it has to be about human well-being.
And that leaves us with this final, really challenging question. Progress at any cost. Is it worth the price? It's a question South Korea had to answer in its own dramatic way. And it's a question that every single society has to face as it decides what kind of future it wants to build.